Welcome to the Creo Collective Positively Irritating webinar with John Ritner. John, when I met you, I went, this dude is so positively irritating. I need to, I got to introduce him to a bunch of my friends, and we got to talk about how we can frustrate people into the kingdom. So it's good to have you, bro.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I missed hanging out with you last week in Florida and excited to do this. And I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the years and our shared love for Jesus and kingdom mischief. So this will be a fun conversation.
Absolutely, man. Yeah. So I think probably the first time I ever saw anything of yours was maybe a video on food trucks as an image of the kingdom. That was a pretty cool video. And then when we met here, I think we met in New York City a few years back.
Oh, that's right.
And then after that have connected in Florida in different spots. But I love the way you think. I love your heart for mission and kingdom and innovation, and love to hear a little bit about your story. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your story, what kind of moved you into the types of things that you've done and where you're at now.
Yeah, absolutely. For, those who aren't kind of familiar with a little bit of my journey, grew up in the church. All six of my parents are pastors in the Methodist denomination, grew up in the Northeast. Didn't really have I say all six because of marriages and divorces and remarriages. But honestly, through all of that kind of religious saturation, never really had a relationship with Jesus. In many ways, I was kind of that expression of a post-Christian kid where I'd been in a Christian environment, been there, done that, not interested, not for me. Went to college, joined a fraternity house, and little did I know that there were 7 Christian guys living in this fraternity house as basically missionaries, expressing the gospel through their lives and trying to embody the kingdom of God. And man, as my moral choices got worse and my depression got greater, their life seemed really appealing to me. And so my sophomore year, I kind of made a decision to follow Jesus, and those guys began mentoring and discipling me. And honestly, that sort of passion for living out the gospel in hard places and making disciples out in the ordinary everyday spaces of life became a theme that kind of has really defined a lot of my life. Ended up going to seminary and then went back to work for my kind of mentor and spiritual father in a church in Williamsburg, Virginia, that at the time was only kind of 700 people, but over the next 10 years grew to be 3,000 plus. And a lot of those early impulses of outward focused disciple making, being sent, missional incarnational living, a lot of that got kind of corrupted just by the inward kingdom building, or I shouldn't say kingdom, the empire building emphasis that sometimes happens in these mega churches. We built the $16 million building, and I was supervising, as executive pastor, basically 60 staff members, and kind of waiting for the tap on my shoulder that you're the next guy to ascend to the throne of this empire that's being built. And I just kind of had some come to Jesus moments at like year 9 and 10 where I thought, this is killing my soul. This is not healthy for me personally. I'm not really sure that what we're doing spiritually and missionally is effective in our community. I think we're just kind of reaching Christians and collecting them from other churches into our space. And we're not really making a difference in the world around us. I mean, the social issues, the racial segregation, the things that I saw in the culture were not things that we were making a dent in. And by God's grace during that time, I felt kind of him calling me to join the work that he was doing in Europe. And so my family and I went to Brussels, Belgium, and joined a team in Brussels that was running a nonprofit called Serve the City that worked with asylum seekers and refugees and homeless and elderly. And then also that team was planting kind of neighborhood microchurches around the city that would express themselves through community, friendship, serving activities during the week. And then once a month, we'd all come together for a kind of a corporate worship gathering as a citywide movement. And for me, that just basically, kind of blew up all of my paradigms of disciple making and church ministry, and helped me realize that so much of what I was doing in America only fit the context of Christendom. It only fit a context where the Christian faith and practices and institutional church were centered already and had power and privilege. And when you went to a culture that was much more post-Christian and secular, none of those tools worked anymore. And I kind of had the sense that like what I'm seeing in Europe is actually what I think is coming to America. And so I better learn this new way and experiment with this new way in order to be able to return to the States, which was always our intention, and lead churches there. And so after 3 years of that sort of experimentation and learning, we took a call to a church in Hollywood, California that was wrestling with these same paradigms of post-Christianity. And I led a church of artists and creatives for 7 years to try to make that transition from a Sunday-centric, program, professional, property-led church to more of a community of everyday missionaries who were making disciples in the places that they live, work, play, and create. And so we went through a long journey there of kind of culture shifting and had some incredible highlights. COVID put a real dent in our community. We lost 2/3 of our existing people. 150 people moved away from Los Angeles during the lockdowns because of how restrictive it was here. And eventually decided that season had come to an end. And I stepped down from doing that about a year ago. And now I've been kind of coaching individual pastors and consulting with denominations and nonprofits to just share a little bit of what I've learned, and honestly, to keep learning myself from others who are facing these same sort of challenges. That phrase "positively irritating" came out of the process of writing a book of my journey, where I took the analogy of a grain of sand that can blow into the eye of a person walking in the beach, and how that grain of sand as an irritant can lead to a response of wanting to wipe your eye clean, to eliminate the irritant from your life so that it doesn't embed in your eye and cause infection. But the irony that same grain of sand as an irritant will embed at the bottom of the ocean into an oyster, and the oyster, rather than trying to eliminate it, will actually embrace it, come around it, and create something beautiful as a response to the irritant. And that beauty, that pearl, becomes a gift to the world. And so how do we take the irritation of post-Christianity, of being decentered, marginalized, maybe even feeling attacked at times in our faith? How do we take that irritant and embrace it and come around it in order to try to create something of beauty for the world around us? How do we have that positively irritating approach to the challenges that we're facing right now?
Yeah, that's really good, man. When you think about Brussels and Hollywood, what are a couple of your key observations, things that you learned where you really saw God work? Very different than traditional, church structure. And it may be one failure, something that didn't work.
Yeah, I think one of the big things you notice pretty quickly in those two environments is that the church itself has no institutional credibility. It's not viewed as a source of good news. It's, if you hear from a friend that a Christian moved in next door, that's not met with, "Oh, great," or "cool," or "you should have him over." It's met with a little bit of like, sorry, suspicion, skepticism. Maybe even an expectation that relationship is going to be a negative one. All the negative connotations that have been well written about in terms of being anti-science or anti-LGBTQ community or judgmental or, certain political affiliations, all those sort of things. There's just such baggage around the idea of being a follower of Jesus in those communities because of the history of the institutional church, especially in Europe. And so, Brad Briscoe had a great line that I stole one time where he said, for the church, you've lost home field advantage. And so as a sports, as an athlete and a sports fan, that, man, there's a bias that happens when you have home field advantage. You feel like the referees are in your favor, the crowd's in your favor, you tend to play with more energy and confidence. When you're on the road, When you feel like everything's against you, you're a little more timid. You feel like you're not getting the calls. It's just a more intimidating environment. And so for most Christians who were raised in the era of Christendom and were kind of protected and shielded and basically grew up in a little bit of like this Christian cocoon and bubble, they just don't have the resiliency and skills it takes to go on the road every day with their faith, so to speak, and try to thrive and impact others. And so I think, that lack of credibility that happens in post-Christian culture, and then also just the recognition that so many of the disciple-making tools that we have developed within the church are centered around inviting people into our sacred spaces, right? Bringing people into our property, inviting them into our programs, introducing them to our professionals. In a post-Christian culture, no one's interested in coming to those things. Unless they already have a relationship with Jesus, that's not a practice that is normal for them. It's literally a cross-cultural experience. In the same way that, for you, it might feel awkward if your Muslim neighbor invited you to to his mosque on the weekend to hear a talk from his imam and bring your kids to join their Sunday school and learn about Allah. You'd have a cognitive dissonance of like, that's not my culture. I don't know what they're going to teach. I don't think I'll be comfortable. I'm not going to know how to behave. And you might be polite, but your instinct would probably be to say, no, I'm not interested. We got that all the time in Europe when we tried to invite people into our spaces. And so what we realized was you have to kind of change that paradigm from an inviting in to much more of a sending out. And so a lot of our time was spent equipping and investing in our people, not to give them tools to invite people to any of our gatherings, but to send and deploy them in order to make disciples in the everyday spaces of their lives, where they were already engaging people, to view themselves as a sent one, to view themselves as a missionary or a pastor, rather than just seeing the professionals as functioning in that. And so a lot of paradigm change around that, a lot of experimentation around that, and a lot of, especially in Hollywood, resistance and recognition from our community that a lot of people who made a decision to follow Jesus as a high school kid or a college kid or in their early 20s, in many ways, they don't feel like they signed up for this. They didn't sign up to be a cross-cultural missionary. They didn't sign up to be an active disciple maker in these hard spaces. They kind of signed up to join a church that had influence and to have the professionals do the ministry. And at most, they were expected to invite someone in and sit next to them and watch this person listen to a gospel presentation and observe community and observe worship, and then trust that God would work in that person's life because of this broader environment, not necessarily because of what the skills that they had. And so it takes a lot of kind of convincing and paradigm change for people to own or accept maybe this call on their life that feels unique in this new era. And so I think I've made my own mistakes in how do you introduce that new paradigm and that idea, and how do you call people to that as something that feels adventuresome and engaging, while also supporting them really well. I'm more apostolic, so I can give the great pitch of let's climb the mountain and let's die for Jesus and let's charge the gates of hell with a squirt gun. But I often don't do as good a job of letting people know that we will support them and sustain them and care for their health while they're taking on these new endeavors as well. And so that's been one of my growth areas, is trying to make sure I'm not just high challenge, but I'm also high support as a leader in the environments that I'm trying to create.
Yeah. So, for those who are a number of our people are pioneering, starting things, creating, going, but we do have some people that are trying to transition, take things that are existing and get people to live their lives as missionaries who then in turn make disciples. What should they expect? You talked about a paradigm shift. Should they expect that they keep 80% of their people, lose 80% of their people? What does that look like? What sort of expectations should people have on the journey?
Yeah, if you're in that kind of transition phase, or I've heard some people call it kind of the remissioning, or retooling is the sports word we'd use. It's not a rebuild, it's a retool with a team that's kind of heading in a new direction. I think a lot of it determines on the pace at which you try to introduce these ideas. You could lose 80% pretty quickly if you try to, bury your existing community under new paradigms, new practices, and you go about change very quickly. We did our best to try to kind of have a level of patience and intentionality to slowly introduce these ideas, primarily through stories. And in order to do that, we knew that we had to have some stories. So for us, it was, pulling out a small group of pioneers, 12, 15 people, bringing them into their own cohort, separate from what we were doing as ongoing church activities around traditional things like Sunday mornings and small groups and serving and stuff, and training them to become missionaries, and then learning from them and letting them get some stories of success and failure, and then sharing those stories on a Sunday morning as a way to introduce some of these new ideas. And by slowly introducing some new paradigms and change, I think we were able to keep more people around and expose them to these ideas. But absolutely along the way, we lost, many people who just decided they weren't interested, hadn't signed up for this. People who had more of a shepherd teaching impulse, who felt like we weren't doing a good enough job focusing on the existing church or the existing Christians and meeting their needs, and that this outward impulse was a little bit of a distraction to maybe our core business, so to speak. And what I tried to comfort myself in, laying in bed at night and going, well, the good news is there are 100 other churches within 10 miles of them that are doing what they're looking for. So it's not like they're walking away from their faith. They're just walking away from our unique community's calling, and they'll find another place to connect. So I do think the speed and pace at which you introduce these sort of ideas and change has a big impact on how many people you can keep around in the process. But I also think that I do see churches and organizations who are trying to make changes who aren't willing to risk enough because of this kind of anxious herding mentality of we have to keep everyone in. And I love the story of John. A story of Jesus in the book of John, where he gives kind of the bread of life discourse, and he just knows this is going to be a hard teaching and not everyone's going to accept it. And a lot of people are going to walk away. And he even turns to his disciples. He goes, do you want to walk away too? And they're like, no, we're in, we're good. And he's like, all right, well, that was a good crowd control sermon that allowed us to thin the flock and get down to people who are really bought in. And now let's kind of go back out in ministry. So I do think there are those times in this pioneering apostolic time, phase, where you do have to kind of cull the herd and thin the flock a little bit and allow people to leave and bless them as they go, not make it a shameful thing or a discouraging thing, but to recognize that we celebrate your calling and we'd love to even help you connect with another church that follows your calling. But we're pretty confident that we're heading in this direction, and there are others who want to go there with us.
Yeah, that's a good point, man. Like I had a friend say something to the effect of, what is it about us that we always feel like we can make the narrow road broad? Right? Such a good statement. Hey, Deb asked a great question. When you talk about speed and pace, Deb asked this question about how long did the transition take you? Which I think if we're taking other people through this paradigm shift, how long did the paradigm shift take for you?
Yeah, for me personally, I would say I was exposed to the ideas for about 6 to 9 months in Virginia, where I began to read some of these books and begin to have my mind open. But it was 2 full years of those first 2 of my 3 years in Brussels, where I really wrestled and had to get irritated. I tell the story in my book about some of the books people were recommending to me I was reading, and I was crossing things out and writing heresy in the in the margins, and no way, and this isn't the gospel, and like putting the book down to not finish it. And then 7 years later, when I sat down to start working on a book, I picked up some of those books to quote for my own thoughts. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this thing I'm quoting 7 years ago, I wrote heresy next to it, but that's often how it is with these new ideas. They get rejected before they actually begin to get internalized and then eventually embraced. And so, thankfully, I had some people in my journey who were willing to give me space to get upset or to argue or to push back. And they were gracious enough to let me kind of have those conversations so that I could kind of discover the truth of this better way on my own. And I think that's one of the challenges that we all have as leaders, is we tend to arrive at these assumptions and these new paradigms ahead of others, and then forget how much wrestling we had to do to get there on our own. We assume that people will just snap into it without knowing, like, it took me 2 years to change this thinking. And then it took our community about 5 years to begin to embrace new practices and to kind of pivot towards new ways of organizing.
Yeah, I think it's Hirsch that quotes Epictetus, who said, it's impossible to get someone to understand something that they think they already know. Yeah. And I think for sure, man, like starting to get people to question what they think they already know, to put the splinter in the mind, that's really good. So you mentioned, and I love the analogy of the away team. How do you function as a good away team? What does it look like to be really good on the road?
I think one of the, especially from a community point of view, not just an individual, but from a community point of view, I think you have to really assess and reevaluate your relationship with power. There was such a power dynamic inherent in the church growth movement. Some of it was, I think, based on the fact that much of the church growth movement was thriving in upper middle class, white, suburban, male-led churches where power was inherently distributed to those leaders through culture. And also there was a level of wealth and size that brought power. When you go on the road all the time and you realize that the scales are tipped against you, you quickly realize you don't have the power to influence others through the means that you had before, and that you're much more of a marginalized movement now. You're much more of a decentered movement. You're working from the outside in, not the inside out. And one of the things that has been so valuable for me, and one of the reasons that I think the future of the church is not just kind of this more missional incarnational, but it's also multi-ethnic, was living in Europe and befriending and living in an international community of African and Persian refugees and asylum seekers, and hearing what their faith journey looked like as they were being persecuted, from converting from Islam to Christianity, and having to kind of sneak out of the house to go to a Bible study and sneak back in, and how they eventually chose to leave their country because their lives were being threatened, and being inspired to kind of understand what it really costs someone who is in a oppositional culture to Christianity. And then here living in the US and learning from Black and brown communities who have been marginalized their entire lives in this country, who have had to express their faith with less financial resources, with less political resources, with less power, and yet are thriving in their community connections, thriving in their ability to make disciples in their own missional spaces. And so, to go on the road as much as we are now in post-Christianity, it's very hard to just lay down all the power that we had 30 years ago. And I think you have to learn that posture from watching others who have been engaging that way for a long time, which is why I think that it's so essential to try to form multi-ethnic communities with people who have had very different cultural experiences than I have. I don't know who I'm all speaking to necessarily here, but me as an upper middle class, white, college educated, affluent male, so to speak, my experience sets me up to act from a place of top-down power. And so I need to learn from others who that's not their experience, and they haven't had to rely on those privileges and advantages, so to speak.
Yeah, man, that kind of reminds me of Jesus's when he sent disciples out in pairs, like, dude, don't take a wallet, don't take your cell phone. I'm given like the new updated version, but everything that makes you feel like you're on top of the world here, I want you to go as like people that are curious, dependent, right, needing the help of others. And I think for sure we need to be people that are listeners, that are, I love what you're saying, man, that are not running and controlling, the culture, the city. Yeah.
That's such a great, I love that idea of curiosity, because again, when I was, came to Christ in 1994 and was being discipled, people are handing me Josh McDowell's, Evidence That Demands a Verdict and Case for Christ and, More Than a Carpenter, all these sort of apologetic books that would allow me to explain and articulate my faith, all under the assumption that people around me were going to ask me questions about these things. And I remember even going to seminary, being fascinated by apologetics and thinking, I'm going to sit in my office all day and people are going to want to come and ask me all these questions about, the historical reliability of the scriptures or whether or not we know Jesus was resurrected. In our culture now, no one cares about that stuff. I mean, in many ways, we're a post-truth culture. So they're skeptical of that sort of truth, or they have no problem saying, well, that's true for you, but not true for me. And so part of that power was assuming that people were going to come to me and want to know what I had to offer. In this culture where that's been flipped, where I don't have that power anymore, my responsibility now comes to become curious about them and to build relationships with them and to live a questionable life, as our friend Mike Frost says, a life that evokes questions for which the gospel is the answer. They're not asking me questions about my spiritual life naturally, because if anything, they think it's antiquated and passé and maybe even a little, unhelpful for our world. And so if all you're used to doing is waiting for others to come to you, your skill set, that just doesn't happen anymore. And so I love that idea of curiosity. It's such a new cultural skill that we need as missionaries, to go be curious of others and ask questions of others that might potentially become reciprocal questions where they ask back of us. When you ask someone, how was your day? It's culturally polite for them to turn around and say, how was your day? So I often try to ask people questions that I hope might get a reciprocal question. So in my missional spaces, one of my favorite go-tos is, hey, did you have any spiritual traditions when you were growing up as a kid? And they answer it. And maybe one out of every 3 times, someone says, that's an interesting question. What about you? Did you? And then I can answer that authentically on my own and try to naturally weave in, a little bit of maybe my spiritual story.
Yeah, that's really good, man. Some of the things that we have valued in the past, like sermons or morality, right? We got to think about different things that we're focusing on when we're looking at kingdom, like questions you mentioned, or I think presence with people and humility, confession, right? Instead of focusing on how do we get people to change their behavior, we need to create communities where we authentically communicate our own brokenness. And that leads to a culture of humility, growth, confession. It's good stuff. Did I lose you, John? You look frozen. Oh, I think we might have lost John for a second here. I'll pause the
point, and you would learn about some new technique and some new 40-day study, some new program that was happening in another part of the country that was working, that was effective, and you'd buy the box and bring it back and try to reproduce it in your own community. There was really no concept of contextualization or will this resonate with my local community. It was like, hey, someone had found the silver bullet, or someone had discovered the formula, and now we're going to go apply the formula to solve the similar problem in our neighborhood. And so it became like a math equation, a technical solution. But not only is every community so different now, but the contextual challenges of each of our neighborhoods and of each of our local cultures, and the gifts and talents of each of our local community, they just don't lend themselves to that sort of plug and play solution. And so, I get so frustrated now that the word missional has become so popular in the last maybe 20 years. I get so frustrated seeing churches who just throw the word missional on their website as if it's a coded formulaic word they can put up there and now signifies to the world that we solved the problem, we're missional, and yet I look at all their cultural elements on their website, or I drive by their buildings or their signs, or I even have conversations with people in their community, and I go, this is not a missional outward impulse that is defining your church. I mean, you don't have any of the cultural elements. What you've done is you've tried to find a word that technically will redefine you and allow you to keep doing what you're doing with this kind of trendy new approach. And it's kind of maddening. And I think many of us who have been in this missional space for, 10 years, maybe even longer, have realized we have to abandon the word missional because it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's been taken over by, attractional style churches and just kind of pirated for their own benefit. And so many of us are looking for new ways to express what we have been trying to do. But I love this idea that, the apologists of our new world are going to be artists. They're going to be people who can display the authenticity of Jesus, the beauty of the kingdom of God in creative ways that are compelling, that evoke curiosity and questions, that feel and look and resonate like good news in a way that our words just don't do anymore. And so, creating cultural elements of your church that tell a better story, creating gospel presentations out in your community that are not simply word-based, that are not, didactic and formulaic, I mean, I haven't drawn a bridge illustration in 10 years or 8 years out here in Hollywood, whereas I used to draw a good old-fashioned, sin separates God from humanity and the cross bridges the gap. I used to draw that all the time in Christendom. But that's not artistic enough. That's not expressive enough for what people are wrestling with right now. They've heard that story and they've kind of rejected it because it feels like bad news to them. Now, that doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean there's not a place for presenting the reality of eternal judgment and the condemnation that comes through sin. But that is not a first step anymore in our culture. The first step that is needed is expressions of beauty and justice and mercy. I don't know if you noticed, Mike Frost just tweeted something out yesterday. I'm not sure where he got it from. It might have been Barna, but some sort of research interview they did with people in their 20s that said, what would you want to see in a church that you attend? And the top 7 answers were all expressions of justice and mercy in the world. They weren't great band, cool youth leader, compelling teaching. They were all they were all a church community that was engaging in the ministry of Jesus in the world to, bring sight to the blind and help the lame to walk and to, value the oppressed and the poor. All of these are pictures of the gospel that then draw people into spaces of curiosity to want to know more about it. And so, the technical definition of the gospel that I learned, which is, Jesus Christ came to die on the cross to save you from your sins so that you can go to heaven when you die. That technical explanation is such a, bad is the word I keep wanting to say, but it's such a reductionistic understanding of the beauty of the gospel that Jesus is portraying all throughout his life, biography, so to speak, in the first 4 Gospels, where there is no cross, there is no blood atonement, there is no sacrificial system that leads to a human dying on behalf of others. What there is are Jesus sending disciples out and telling them to embody and proclaim the kingdom of God has come, and to say the way you'll know it's come is because you'll see it through these demonstrations that in many ways become like Jesus's miracles. They become pictures of the kingdom.
That's good, John. Hey, thanks for joining us. For all those who are going to tune in later, if you're watching this later, you got to check out John's book, Positively Irritating. If you haven't seen that, it's fantastic. So, John, thanks for hopping in with us, sharing, giving some really fantastic input, some great ideas. Sorry about your Wi-Fi, but it's been great. Good stuff.
Absolutely, man. Appreciate it. Thanks for the invite.